Hi, it's Sue and we're back again for the My Magical Garden Quilt Along. Can you believe that we're already putting it all together? This is month 9 of our Quilt Along. We've made all of these gorgeous blocks with our leaves galore and our hearts and more tools. So I feel like now you have a really good understanding of how to use the hearts and more and the leaves galore tools. Now there are more things I can teach you, so we will be doing another quilt along next year with some different shapes. We're going to do some clamshell shapes and some other things with our tools, but let's not talk about next year just yet. Let's get back to our quilt at hand. You've already made all 12 blocks, and you've made your applique borders and your pieced borders with the half square triangles. So this month we're going to be putting it all together. So what we've been doing today is laying out our 12 blocks in the order that we want them. And then what we're doing is we're sewing the seams together between the blocks with a 1/4 inch seam. But I want to point out a problem right here with the pieced blocks. We have 2 blocks coming together, and this background here is the same on this block and on this block. So we're actually going to take out this seam, we're going to spin this block around so that we have 2 different fabrics here and here. Now we noticed a couple of places where that happens. When you first lay out your blocks you might not notice it, but I want you, before you get to this point, before they're sewn together, I want you to pay attention to which blocks are coming together. Normally if you spin by a 1/4 turn or a 1/2 turn, you're going to get rid of that problem. Now the order of these blocks is not the order in which we made them. I didn't want to keep all the blocks together that were made with the same tool, so we've scattered them around and we've made it look attractive, but there are certain blocks that can't be changed because they're directional blocks. So pay attention to those, leave those in place, and spin the blocks next to them if you need to change your colors around. So as we're sewing our first 3 together, our second 3 together, we're making these rows, and then the next step would be to flip this one down, and we're going to match up all of our seams. We've got a seam here, 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 and here. We're going to match up those seams and make sure these all fit together perfectly. Now if you squared up your blocks properly, that should be very, very easy. And if you're doing all one fabric in the background, it's even easier. Then we're going to add our half square triangle borders. So I'm going to give you a few tips about your half square triangle borders, and then we're going to talk about adding the half square triangles and our applique borders, and then our final half square triangle border in the end. So let's get to those tips about sewing your half square triangle borders and making sure that they're accurate. Joanne has made all of her blocks with one print background. We're going to be sewing Joanne's version together today too, so you can see both of our finished My Magical Garden quilts in 2 different color combinations. When making our half square triangle borders, it's very important that we are really accurate with our seams and make sure that we have exactly a 1/4 inch here and a 1/4 inch over here when we're sewing these together. If our seams tend to wander and we get less than a 1/4 inch right here, for example, we're going to want to make those adjustments one by one to make sure that we don't have inaccurate triangles. First, I make sure that my cutting mat is marked accurately. This is the measuring tool I used for my blocks, so I know my 20-inch finish size blocks measured up to this tool right here. Now I'm looking at this cutting mat and it measures up perfectly. So now I'm just going to use the cutting mat to make sure that all of these triangles measure the right size. So I will start right here in the middle, and I'm going to measure that middle seam, and I'm going to place that on the 30 marking on my board. Then I'm going to come down to this one right here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 triangles down the line. I want to make sure that that 5th triangle is exactly at 20 inches, and it is. Now sometimes, especially if you're not careful with pressing, you might get some bowing of your borders. That means that the bottom is tighter than the top, either because of sewing or because of pressing. Now I do see a little bit of bowing here, and it's not going to be an issue unless I have a lot of fullness up here at the top. Then if I do, I'm going to look at each individual seam and see if my seams are truly straight. Now this one doesn't look like a problem because I'm going to have 20 inches here from this seam to this seam, and there's not a lot of fullness up at the top. But as I go away from that center, I think I was getting tired putting together these half square triangle units. So it looks like I'm just over 20 inches right here. I'm going to measure the next 5 and make sure they all stay right around 20 inches. And we're doing pretty well, but I do know that these are bowed towards the end. You can see how they curve down here. So I'm going to measure every 10 inches and see where my fullness is. I can see right here that I don't have a 1/4 of an inch here or here or here, and that's going to cause me problems when I sew this border on, because if I sew it on with a 1/4 of an inch seam, I'm going to lose all of those points. So let's look at some of those seams and see what the problem is. Well, I can see right here on this seam that it starts off good. I start at a true 1/4, but then I get slightly smaller towards the tip. So if I look at several of these seams, I have a feeling it's the same problem throughout. That's because I was feeding in my triangles into the sewing machine this way, and by the time I got to the end, I lost control of this end and it tended to go in a little bit on my stitching, and I'm not going to have a true 1/4 inch on every single one of these points. So I'm going to go back in and I'm going to find the worst actors here, and I'm going to put this into my sewing machine this way. So the light colors go in first. That's where most of my problem is. I'm going to just taper this seam slightly so that it starts out at a true 1/4 and then it tapers right off to where it was a true 1/4 down here at the green end. So if I adjust several of these, then I'm going to take away this fullness at the top here. Let's make those changes now. Then I'll show you how I sew the half square triangle borders onto the center of the quilt. So we've gone ahead and made some adjustments on the half square triangles, and now I have it laid out on my floor. I'm just looking to make sure that I know which borders go where, and I have my inside borders first. You can see that inside border there. See what that looks like? It has the darker color going toward the inside of the quilt. So when pinning the half square triangles to the quilt, the first thing I'm going to do is match up this center point. At this center point, that's where I opened up my border seam, and my seams underneath are also opened up. And so I'm able to match that seam perfectly. Then I'm going to count over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This seam should land right in the center of your block, and count over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this seam right here should match up with this seam between the blocks. and get beautiful intersections at your points. So let me just, I wouldn't normally move this around, but because of the camera angle here, instead of moving the camera, I'm going to move my work. So this end right here, I know that the end matches up with the end of my blocks. I'll use another forked pin there, even though there's nothing to match. And then I'm going to split the difference. So I'm going to hold those two pins taut, and I'm just going to lift that fabric up, fluff it up a little bit, and I'm looking right here, halfway between. I'm going to just adjust this edge so it matches the edge underneath. You can see it's just matching right here underneath. And let's keep all of those seam allowances going in the right direction and use that pin to pin it down. Now we might have a little pressing error right here, but we're going to sew it the right way, and then we'll go back and repress this area. These are my favorite little scissors right here for cutting. They are just beautifully made. They are sharp right up to the tip. So if I snip that down a little bit closer, I'm going to be able to get a more flat seam right here when I press this again. So that's my tip of the day here. For any seams that are not pressed in the correct direction, go ahead and snip that seam and then press the rest of it in the correct direction so you don't continue that problem way up here. Now you can see that in the center, I've pushed all of my seams on my border in one direction over on this side, and all of these on this side go in the opposite direction. I start in the center and I go down this way. My presser foot is pressing these in the correct direction. Then I start in the center again. Turning my work over, I go down this way. Because these are now also underneath the machine, they're going down toward you, and that's going to be easy to control on your sewing machine. Now it's always a challenge to sew with the camera right here. Because I started in the center, all of my seam allowances are coming down toward me, so it's very easy to make sure those seam allowances are heading in the right direction. I do have a walking foot feature on my sewing machine. I always sew with a walking foot on this machine. If you're having any trouble easing these in at all, then go ahead and use your walking foot on your sewing machine. Now these are going on beautifully. After I sew on my two side borders, I'm going to do the same with my two top and bottom borders. Then I will have all four borders sewn to the applique center. Then we'll talk about putting our applique borders on. In this case, on Joanne's version of the quilt, we decided not to applique those borders. We used a very, very busy background fabric, and that's giving us the ability to skip the applique on the borders and just let that fabric sing. Let the fabric do all the work. So here now I've gone from the center out, and now I'm going to turn my quilt right over. Now in my first couple of stitches here, I did catch my seam allowance and it's pushing in the wrong direction. So I'm just going to release those threads. I feel as though it's very important to make sure that our seam allowances are always staying in the direction that they're pressed. Just for neatness on the back of your quilt, And for ease of stitching, especially if you are doing your own machine quilting, so I do take the time to really pay attention to my pressing plan and to make a pressing plan before I press each section of the quilt. Now from here, my pins are actually on the bottom because I had pinned from the top. I know that with my sewing machine, I can go over those pins. If you decide to sew this way, the way that I do, and have your half square triangles on the bottom, after you've pinned on half of your border, you can turn your work right over and pin the other half as in the same direction as though you're sewing it together. You're going to be pinning it the same way you're sewing it. That way you won't have the problem of these pins hiding underneath where it's difficult to see them. Now, even though I know my machine can go over the pins, I walk them over. I walk the machine over the pins. I don't sew at full speed over those pins because you are bound to hit one dead on one day and throw off the timing on your machine. So even though I do occasionally go over pins, I do it very, very carefully, walking over those pins one at a time by using the hand crank on the machine to get over that pin. Here comes another one. I'll show you what I mean. I'm just going to walk it over one stitch at a time. When I really get to that pin, I'm going to do that last stitch by hand just to make sure I don't jam the machine. So if you're smart about it, you can do that too. But I don't want you to say that Sue Pelland told me to sew over my pins and now I've jammed my machine. You have to do things in a very, very thoughtful and slow way to make sure that you treat your machine with as much care as it needs. Here I'm coming up to my very last pin. I'm just about to hit it with that needle, so let me take that last stitch by hand and then I can go. And we're going to inspect this and see how we did. We want to see if we made our points beautiful, like this one right here. That looks fantastic. So my seam allowances were all just about perfect. Look at those matching intersections with our triangles. I couldn't get much better than that. Here's another opportunity for me to show you how picky we need to be when we are sewing our seams together. This seam starts off beautifully on this end. You can see that it's a nice 1/4 of an inch. Now right here, my background fabric starts to show right here. So I might find that this seam right here is not a true 1/4 of an inch, and then it gets worse and worse right here, and then it goes back on track right here. I would end up taking out this seam between my fingers, here to here. This whole edge right here is not lined up properly. Now what happens is when you open this up, you can see that my intersections here are not perfect. I should be right up here on the white or just one hair away, and I'm not there. And this one isn't good either. This one is fine. So the seam that I'm going to sew is those 2 points right here, and I'm going to adjust that. What I have to do is I have to take out my seam allowance from here to here and just readjust this to move this up. Now another thing that I do take the time to do after I sew my seam, and I'm looking to inspect all of those half square triangle units, at the same time I'm going to clip any threads find one here. If I see a thread coming through, we're going to pull that thread gently. If it's attached to something, then we have to clip it. If it comes out easily, go ahead and pull it out. So I do that after every seam. Now, you may not be a perfectionist, but if you just follow some of these simple tips, your work can continue to get better and better, and your quilts too will end up showing beautifully in your local quilt show or even your national quilt shows. So by taking care every step of the way, that's how you're going to make show quality quilts. When marking your plain borders, you're going to find the center of that border. I found the center by folding the border in half, and then I've marked it with a chalk line. From there, I'm going to measure over 10 inches, and I'm marking another chalk line at the 10-inch marking. So I just run this ruler right along that chalk line, my first one, and mark another chalk line over here. Now I'll do that to make 8 different sections, 10 inches apart. And then on the very end of the borders, after I mark my 8 10-inch sections, which will match up with the sides of the quilt, that will be 4 20-inch sections that go along with the 4 20-inch blocks. So at the end of this last 10-inch section, we're going to slide over by 2 inches, and we're going to mark 2 inches over, or that is the width of the half square triangle border. So that's why in our instructions it says to mark 8 sections 10 inches apart, and then on the very last part we're going to mark a 2-inch line 2 inches away from that last marking. That way when we measure this up with our quilt, that's going to be a total of 84 inches, which is the same size as the half square triangle border. Now there will be an extra 1/4 inch right here. That's your seam allowance. So the full measurement of from one line to the next is 84 inches, but it'll be 84.5 including your seam allowance. Now let's fit this border onto our half square triangle border. So now that I have all my 10-inch markings, I'm going to pin these markings and make sure that the marking is in the same position as our seam. So if I just open this up a little bit, I see the marking going right on top of the seam, and I know that pinning is correct, and the size of my border is now correct. So I'm going to ease in any fullness that there is right here and continue splitting and pinning. Now I always say divide and conquer. If you have any fullness underneath, you're going to divide that fullness along this whole edge and then put a pin right in the middle and keep pinning until you don't have any more bumps and lumps. Now this is fitting very well because we took the time to adjust those seam allowances. But if they didn't fit properly, that divide and conquer technique is how I would make these borders fit on properly. It's more important, however, that you make your adjustments in your seam allowances instead of just easing in the fullness, because you'll get a much better and flatter result. And when we're quilting, we want to take precautions all the way along the way. Make sure that everything fits properly. The more easing or fudging that you do, it's going to show in your finished project, and we're not going to have a professional looking result. On Joanne's borders, her borders are primarily white. Now they're very busy, so it might be easiest to mark these lines with a pin right here. And we're going to mark this end as well, because not only are we putting this border onto the half square triangles here, we're going to also be putting half square triangles onto the other end. So just make note of that. When you're ironing these pieces, you don't want to erase these markings. And if you're using the iron erasable chalk or friction marking pen, that will get erased with the iron. So you might not want to iron these borders after you put them on until we're completely done. We can finger press the seams that matter, but for now, let's go ahead and mark with the friction marking pen. And then when we pin all of this together and sew it, we're not going to iron those seams. Now that we've added our first 8.5 inch border, we have a line that's already marked on the border for the end of the quilt. We need to measure over 1/4 inch from that line. Make sure that your ruler lines up right here with your half square triangle border and matches up with that line. This line also should line up with the edge of the border. So make those adjustments as necessary and then trim that last side of your border. Because we've done measurements all the way along, we could have cut this border to the right length to start with. Doesn't matter whether you do it now or whether you had done it before. I find it easier to do it now so that we make sure it's completely in line with the half square triangle border. We'll do that on both ends, and then we'll pin on our applique border that will go all the way across here to the very end right here.